Welcome to the Costume Plot.
I'm JoJo Siu.
And I'm Sarah Tim. We're professional designers with a passion for costume design and the performing arts. Our podcast does contain spoilers. Accompanying slideshows for each movie are linked in the episode description.
We hope you'll join us every other week as we delve into the wonderful world of costume design in the Costume Plot.
Hello, and welcome back to the Costume Plot.
Hi, here we are.
Yes.
Feels like been 5 years since we recorded.
It always feels like so much time.
Yeah.
We just lose track of time, especially with COVID.
Yeah, and I've been knee deep in the Her Universe fashion show, and I see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I can do other things.
Exciting. Yes, very exciting. All right, so I'm going to dive right in.
Yeah.
We are covering some new genre today. We're going to be covering some TV shows this month, which I'm super excited about.
Woohoo. And
of course, with TV shows, we're only able to really cover one episode because there's just so much that happens in a TV series, which is kind of incredible that they're able to fit all of that into 45 minutes. But we're going to be talking about some fun period pieces as well as some sci-fi stuff.
Yeah.
So we're going to start off with our period TV series. I guess that's our that's our genre today.
Yeah. It's so funny because period can refer to like anything that's not contemporary, but like what other is it? It's their period.
It's very, very true. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the show Poldark, which if you guys haven't heard of that, it's set in the kind of late 1790s, and it follows Poldark, who's played by Aidan Turner, and he basically he comes home from war and he finds out his whole family has been killed, but he takes over the mining company that his family was in charge of, and so it's kind of him rising up in the ranks of this political turmoil, and also kind of recreating jobs. He's sort of the superhero everyman. He's a very humble man, but he's also a very proud man. But he also is a great leader. So he ends up making some really integral choices. And of course, a lot of the townspeople end up following him because of his father's reputation. And so it's a lot about him and his relationship with Demelza, who ends up becoming his wife. And she comes from very humble background, but ends up becoming this really strong, powerful woman beside him.
Nice.
So it follows their relationship, but there's a lot of different relationships around them as well. And he's kind of the tortured sort of bad boy, but of this time period, if that makes any sense. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. Let me grab my notes because for some reason I thought I had them out and I didn't.
I watched a couple episodes of this show because everybody in the costume shop at SCR really likes it, but that was years ago, and like I don't know why I stopped watching it. I think I got busy or I got bored, and I was like, I'll pick this up later, and then I didn't.
This is definitely a show that moves very slow.
Right.
I will say that, and especially in the beginning when you're still trying to get to know the characters. To be honest, his wife Demelza is one of my favorite characters just because she's the most interesting. She's essentially like, she's like the lowest of the lowest class. And she comes from a family where her father is fairly abusive. She's got two brothers and she's really only ever been raised by men. And she comes in looking pretty much homeless. Like she's essentially on the street with her dog, and her dog's like a street dog that gets pulled into a dog fight.
Aww.
And so it's like basically Poldark finds her trying to save her dog because they're trying to take it from her and force it into this fight. And she looks like this really ratty boy. Like I think he actually mistakes her for a boy when they first meet. So anyways, it's pretty funny, but yeah, she's a really fiery kind of firecracker throughout this entire show. And she also just, because of her humble beginnings, she's a very down-to-earth character. And she also comes in and starts making really wise choices. The other big part of this show is that she is like the most faithful wife, even though Aiden throughout the entire, or Poldark throughout the entire show, has this sort of side thing, like a long lost love with another lady who is married to someone else, even though he made the choice to marry Demelza. But
wow.
anyways, that gets into a whole backstory with this show. There's a long, long period of time where you're just on again, off again, and you're just like, why won't you just love her? You already married her, so it's too late. Like, but anyways.
Oh boy. And this is why we pick only one episode, because like it could get, we could get carried away.
Absolutely. As you can tell, I've already spent 5 minutes describing this. So let me tell you a little about this.
But we love a man who saves a dog.
That's true. That's true. So let me tell you about this particular episode. Obviously, with TV shows, you'll often get directors who work on just a few episodes and not necessarily the entire season. But with costume designers, you will often find that they work on an entire season at a time. All right. So the director for this was Josh Agnew. He's known for directing a couple different episodes of The Irregulars, which I think is the most recent. The Split, which I've never heard of, but it was also on there. Mr. Selfridge, which is another really great period costume piece. Jekyll and Hyde, which, again, I think that one was also a TV miniseries, and I think he did the whole thing for that one. And then he did 11 episodes of Poldark, mostly from seasons 3 and 4. And then for the costume designer, so Poldark actually had 2. There was, I believe her name was Marianne Agercroft, was for the first 2 seasons. And then Howard Burden took over for seasons 3 through 5. So he's done Poldark, obviously, but he's also done a TV miniseries for War of the Worlds, apparently.
Oh.
And then Red Dwarf, it says he did 62 episodes. I don't think that's the entirety of the show, but it sounds like he did a good chunk of that show for a while. And then he also did Jekyll and Hyde, which is very likely where he potentially met Josh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there were a couple, like, really quick, just a quick summary of this particular episode so I can kind of go into the characters a little bit more. So the big things that happened during this episode, Ross, who is basically the first name of Poldark. So Ross Poldark, he's approached to replace a member of parliament. So this is season 3. At this point, they've got a little bit more money from his mining company, so they're a little better off. He still has a lot of his staple pieces from the previous seasons, but now there's an interview with Howard Burden where they talked about building him some newer trench coats and some like nicer outerwear, things that he would have kind of procured with his finances. And same thing with his wife. George Warlegan is kind of his opposite. He's kind of like his enemy the entire time, and he is the one that actually is trying to gain the same spot in Parliament. And he ends up getting the spot at the very end of the episode. But he is not a very good man. He's the one that ends up marrying Ross's first love, Elizabeth.
Oh.
So they are the kind of other big couple that's a prominent feature of this season. Demelza, of course, Ross's wife, she attracts the attention of another young poet. So again, by season 3, Demelza has just continued to remain faithful to Ross over and over and over again. You could argue that there's a little bit of kind of, what's that? I can't remember what the name of the word is, but it's like that syndrome where basically if you're kidnapped.
Stockholm syndrome?
Thank you. Stockholm syndrome, where she, like, obviously she's been saved from her father and from the abuse that she had at home, and she's been married and kind of brought up in this better life. But throughout this entire time, she's proved faithful and has told Ross over and over again that she's in love with him, even though he keeps saying he's sort of also in love with Elizabeth, his first love. And so this episode, she finally gets the attention of another young poet and admirer who Poldark has actually saved in a war. And so he comes back and he's in these like very nice finery and basically kind of slowly keeps hitting on Demelza, but Poldark doesn't seem to notice because he's too busy thinking about all the other politics and stuff. So Poldark's kind of the jerk in this season. Third character story line that's happening here is, I know this is a long one. So Morwenna is another kind of female friend in the town. And basically she is in love with Demelza's younger brother, Drake. However, in order to save his life, she has to make a hard choice and she ends up marrying this really brutal, kind of rapist, but ends up marrying her, Ozzy, who basically kind of blackmails her into marrying him. And so she ends up forced to marry him in order to save Drake. And then Drake has to basically move on because, you know, she's already in this marriage. And meanwhile, no one really knows, but she's being sexually abused in the marriage. She's basically been ravaged by this guy, and she has nothing to do with him. You know, she doesn't love him at all. And then the final couple, we will go through all of these characters, I promise. Caroline and Dr. Ennis are kind of finally engaged. So they've been an on-again, off-again couple as well. Caroline is actually an incredibly wealthy socialite. And so she actually comes into this kind of as an independent woman. So she is sort of the face of the independent woman as opposed to all the other women who kind of are linked to a man, even though she does eventually get married. But she's actually chosen to marry essentially beneath her station. So the doctor at this time is a very humble doctor. He's certainly not someone who's wealthy, and there's a big talk about that with their marriage. But she falls in love with him, and so they're planning their nuptials. So a big part of their story in this episode is just them planning their marriage. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple like wedding party scenes, which I thought was kind of a good example of all the costumes from this time period.
Yeah.
So the great thing about this episode is that you really do get to see kind of the dichotomy between really high-end fashion of this time as well as really, really like lower class, poor people. And I think there's some really fun kind of secrets that Howard kind of included in there. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of his quotes about the characters as we go through them. But the other thing that's interesting to note is that he didn't necessarily go straight period. There are definitely elements that are very, very period silhouette. But he made some like specific choices in terms of the details that definitely look like they're influenced by other periods as opposed to just the 1790s. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've started off with this scene of Morwenna, who is this woman in the pink. And this is her praying with Ozzy. So Ozzy is in the background in the gold. And you can already tell he's kind of a sleazebag, just the way that they've sort of dressed him. Like he's in this gold to indicate that he does have a little more wealth than her. And he clearly uses that in his abuse of power, obviously. But also just the fact that they've kind of emphasized his belly was something that I wanted to point out. And I'll show a clearer picture of him in a second. But I wanted to take note of the kind of almost ratty looking pink robe that she's got on, because it looks like it's a really nice material, but it certainly looks like it's aged or like it's been some sort of a hand-me-down that he kind of grabbed either from his mother or just from another woman in the household that he kind of just threw to her. And she's just, because she's now the wife of the house, she's gotten it by proxy. Mm-hmm. This is actually one of his daughters, I believe. I believe he actually already has daughters. And so she comes into this household already with him having children. I think that he fathered by two other illegitimate out of wedlock situations. So yes, clearly this whole scene already is very ominous because he kind of comes in basically asking her for sex. And she's kind of in the middle of prayer and trying to prolong it as much as possible so she can avoid it.
Ooh, that's awful.
So just a clearer picture of him, you can see, and again, that gold color just to sort of indicate very clearly that he's the wealthy one. The Howard actually did mention that for Morwenna, a lot of her colors were very like he wanted to reference the sea, and he wanted to reference a very earthbound color. So even though the pink is a little bit more on the paler side, and it's not quite sea colors, but I think of kind of like the pink seashells or this idea of like the beachy kind of coral colors,
right,
that I think still fit within that idea. Okay. Let's see. Oh, the other thing that I thought was interesting is in this scene, and even in the last picture, she's in this white nightgown. But the interesting thing that I find so fascinating here is that both of them actually have about the same size belly, because she is pregnant in this photograph. But the way that they've arranged the robe on her makes her look so much more frail because it just looks like it's kind of oversized.
Yeah.
Whereas with him, they've really chosen to emphasize the belly and make that kind of look like that sort of sleazy effect, and also still give him that idea of kind of wealth, because we talk about wealth in that time being associated with how much food you have.
Exactly.
Because you can afford food,
Yep.
right? So just the fact that they've shown that even with where they've placed the opening of the robe, I thought was really very good on the costumer's part.
Totally. I think that's something that people like to forget because our modern beauty standards are so much about thinness that like rich people were often pretty rotund back in the day, and it's okay to portray that.
Yeah, so true. So next I have Aunt Agatha, and she is kind of the matriarch of the Poldark house. And she is one of my favorite characters besides Demelza. She isn't in this for very long, and she actually ends up dying this episode.
No.
So sorry, spoiler alert. But she has this whole big thing where she is actually trying to celebrate her 100th birthday because she claims that she's 99. And so she's kind of dressed, obviously, in a much more dated fashion. We talk a lot on the podcast about dressing our older characters in something a little further back or a little pushed back in terms of time period.
Yep.
And her dress, interestingly enough, is kind of a mix of like a morning dress that's a little more Victorian, which would have been later, in addition to the kind of 18th century robe de française. Because I don't have a good picture of the back, but apparently there is that kind of pleated back kind of cape that's part of the robe from the 18th century. So he obviously kind of mixed and mashed elements for this dress. One of the interesting things that they mentioned, I was kind of actually reading this on another blog. Someone had ended up finding a picture of like a 1900s early Edwardian dress that was also in this kind of black color, and it had very similar sleeves. I think, did I pull it for this?
Oh,
let's see. Oh, here it is.
Oh, wow.
So you can kind of see a lot of the same shapes and silhouette is kind of utilized in this dress. So this is a full body picture of our Aunt Agatha. And she's kind of a firecracker too. She just sort of says whatever comes into her mind. And then half the time she's like sitting near the fireplace playing with like tarot cards. Oh. So she's always making these predictions about stuff. But
she sounds rad.
So she is. She's pretty rad. I was like, I want her as my grandma.
Yeah.
And then she's also wearing kind of the mob cap that is very common from the kind of 1740s. So a lot of her dress is obviously inspired by the 1740s, much earlier in the time period. It's about 50 years back. So you can see that she obviously hasn't really changed too much because people were wearing their clothes for much longer than we do today.
Yeah.
But, you know, like clearly Howard has brought in some kind of more modern sensibilities, or modern to this time, I should say. All right. So Elizabeth, you can see here in the foreground, this is the woman that basically Ross Poldark has been in love with since childhood. He basically left off to war and like she pledged her love to him, and then he came back and she was engaged to his brother. So that was a whole nother thing. And then, of course, the brother died. So now she's married to his arch enemy, George Warlegan. So in this next picture, it's the two of them. They're already married at this point. But you see George in quite a few of these kind of really deep red cutaway coats, which I think is such a lovely color on him. But it is also interesting that it's this is during the time of the French Revolution, and a lot of times we see those French soldiers in that kind of red. Obviously not this muted, but I don't know if that was an intentional choice by Howard, but it is interesting that he's put him in that kind of red color. And then in contrast, we have Elizabeth in the kind of more muted. It looks green here, but in other scenes, it actually looks more blue. And this is what I kind of meant by it looks like he took the period. But there's not too many dresses that actually have that kind of almost like they've exposed a stomacher as opposed to, or having like a contrasting stomacher as opposed to the actual time period. You didn't see a lot of this shape or seam lines.
You know where we've seen that before is Hamilton. The dresses in Hamilton had that exact cut that like, it's like a upside down U shape across the bodice.
Exactly.
So interesting.
Exactly. And you see this a lot in this show. So it's an interesting choice, obviously, but it's actually not factually period, but it's a really nice, I think, use of that line that he uses. And he does a lot of that sort of contrasting, like one is a pattern and then one is a solid.
Right.
And then he did mention that for Elizabeth, he used a lot of moire. which is kind of that sort of, it almost looks like it's got a little bit of a sheen and it sort of shines and moves when you look at it. And I believe he wanted to use that just to sort of emphasize a little bit more of her wealth as well. But he also talks a lot about how she is actually fairly simple in her dress. Like she doesn't wear a lot of frills. Specifically in season 1, the original costume designer made a point not to put her in any kind of extra ruffles. She's not very fussy. And I think Howard kept a little bit of that in this season as well. Okay. So this is actually a picture of Demelza, and she's got a couple different outfits, but she's always in these kind of really beautiful earth tones. So she has a lot of this kind of reddish rust orange that she wears a lot of. And Howard actually, and this also happened in the first 2 seasons with the first designer. But I think just to bring out her orange hair, they put her in a lot of either dark reds or maroons or like really warm tones to kind of help enhance that. And that's something that you always kind of associate with her character. They also really pair it in contrast with, it is almost like, I'm blanking on words right now, but like complementary colors.
Oh, yeah.
Where they're kind of matching. It's not quite red, but it's more of like a rust red.
Yeah, but it's the tones.
Right.
Sure.
And so he does that a lot, I think, for her character. And again, kind of making her look very much like that kind of lower class silhouette, in contrast with everyone else that is seen in high society. And obviously she does have nicer dresses that she goes to parties with, which we will talk about later. But this is kind of her at-home look because she does most of the farm work when Poldark is out cavanting everywhere or like dealing with politics and stuff. So she does end up kind of taking over the household and taking over the chores and the duties on the farm. And you see that reflected in her costume.
Totally.
Okay. I think I did these a little out of order, but that's okay. So this was another image that I wanted to pull because these are actually all the servants at George Warlegan's house. And I just thought it was so interesting that clearly we've got the same silhouette, but these are very unusual colors, or at least not colors that we typically associate with this time. So that kind of olive, almost pea green
like
is so interesting in terms of the choice. And then I just wanted to pull this because it really does show like kind of the maid costume from that time as well. So that one was pretty accurate, I think, to the time period. And then we have here, I believe he's asked them to find something that he thinks the grandmother or Aunt Agatha has hidden from him. It's like a pretty important piece of information. So he's got this is like his goon who he kind of sends around the house to look for stuff. So this is when he's telling his staff to start looking for this stuff because he thinks she's kept it from him.
Such interesting livery.
George Warlegan is a very suspicious character. Like he suspects everybody and he doesn't trust anybody. And there's like a fairly big secret, which I won't reveal necessarily, but he ends up getting it used against him at the very end of this episode. Okay. So I wanted to touch very briefly on Poldark. This is essentially what he's in for most of the show. Right. He's in a lot of like monochromes, a lot of really dark browns, a lot of grays and kind of different charcoals and blacks. This is that long coat that we were talking about. You can't really see all the way to the bottom, but it's actually pretty much a floor-length trench coat that he wears everywhere. So it's very regal whenever he walks or rides anywhere. But this was something I believe they added for this season, which is what Howard was talking about having made. But otherwise, you always see him with this kind of open high vest collar, which we have talked about this in the past as well, like really making the guy look really sexy and really like attractive, is leaving that kind of exposed neck, which they definitely use a lot on the show. And then that kind of curly, unkempt hair is definitely something that kind of just adds to his whole character of sexiness because everyone's kind of in love with him, including Elizabeth, even though she's married to someone else. Okay. So then just another picture of Demelza, same outfit, but I wanted to show her next to her 2 brothers. And let's see, I had a really funny quote that Howard said. He said, where did I put it? Okay. So he said, Sam and Drake are dressed as the lowest rung of the ladder in ill-fitting clothes, like dead people's clothes.
Oh.
So I was like, oh, well, it really looks like that. Like he kind of it looks like they like picked something off of someone who died and then put it on because that was all they had. And I find it so interesting. So Sam is actually the older brother. And he is actually a pastor. So he basically, the entire time, he tries to shepherd the townspeople. And he's like pastor of a really small parish in the town. So he's dressed very conservatively, but also very simply. And it's so interesting to me, like the way that they've kind of addressed and distressed everything. And I think that was something that the costume designer really loved doing. He likes to do a lot of distressing. And so he was really excited about that. And then Drake, who is kind of our like lovesick poet, he's the one who's in love with Morwenna and of course has to give her up to be married to this horrendous man. And so this whole episode is kind of in depression for a good chunk of the episode. But I find it so interesting that he's wearing like thousands of layers and nothing quite fits him. So he's got like 2 vests on, both double-breasted. Yeah. And then he's got this additional coat on top of that. And none of it fits very well.
Yeah.
And the costume designer also talked about that, how everything was sort of like a little too big on him. So I thought that was really interesting. But he kept them mostly in very, very muted and kind of blend into the background earth tones. So I thought that was also really interesting because it really does show not just their status, but that they've kind of, they've been living outside. They've been wearing this for a long time. They're probably not showering. They're not necessarily washing their clothes all the time because this might be the only thing they own. So it's interesting that he's really shown that character in the clothes. All right. So in contrast to all of that dirtiness, this is Caroline and Dr. Ennis. And this is when they're making some announcements at their like wedding reception or wedding banquet. And this is like pre-wedding. But I wanted to pull these because there's not much notes. I just really loved both of the looks.
Yeah.
Again, he's always in kind of like really humble, like brown. He's typically in more like tweeds with his coats, but they always look really clean. So like clearly he has a little bit of money. It's just not as much money as Carolyn over here. So she is kind of the essential or quintessential like height of the fashion. She clearly is affording the most affordable dresses. But again, the costume designer does that same kind of U-shaped cutout here where they've got the contrasting stomacher piece. And then I love the little kind of almost like, it makes me think of like rainbow yogurt or like rainbow sherbet, but the stripes that she's got on her dress.
Yeah, pastel.
I just thought was just really fun. So that's all I had to say about that. It's just really pretty.
Very pretty.
And then, of course, the doctor, he's almost got this like taffeta coat or 2-piece kind of suit. And this is that cutaway coat that's from that time period, which was very common. So that I thought was pretty close to accurate in terms of the time period. And then he's got this beautiful, looks like silk striped vest. And then just all the buttons, all the things.
All the buttons.
So many buttons at this time period. So that was very, very accurate to period. Yeah. All right. So this is what Demelza is wearing at this wedding party. Pretty. And again, I just pulled it up because it's just so gorgeous. And like in terms of color palette, like they've kind of brightened up this image. In the actual show, it's not quite this vibrant, but it's still pretty close. So like just seeing her in this beautiful, luscious green, in comparison to the green that I'll show you in a second, that ends up on Morwenna. There's a very clear difference between how the costume designer has shown like life and lusciousness in comparison to like paleness and like close to death. So I just thought this was really lovely. And I love the little shirring detail that he's put at her sleeves. Like, again, it's very simple because she's a very humble kind of farmer / peasant's daughter. But he's clearly brought in little details to make her kind of dressed up. So this is what her understanding of looking classy might be in comparison to the other two.
And the simplicity just highlights her own natural beauty, too, like in contrast to the frilliness and the fussiness of more high society women.
Yeah, agreed. And she does this a lot, too, where she kind of just has like a single ribbon through her hair, which I love.
So pretty.
It's a very different way of doing her hairstyle. And you can see Caroline's hair is very much that kind of pompadour hairstyle, which is very characteristic of the late 1790s. So again, good job on on the hair person for making accurate hairstyles.
I do think that's a lot of period stuff will really lose it on the hair.
Agreed. Absolutely. So in contrast, so this is Morwenna, and this is supposed to be like a slight green, but you can tell it's definitely closer to like a puce color. And like Elizabeth ends up making a comment during this when they enter, and she talks about how like she looks so pale, and like she already suspects that it's her husband who's causing that paleness. But like clearly the costume designer is spared no extra expenses on making her really look like a body of puke. Like it definitely screams that all the way down.
It's like dirty dishwater color.
Yeah, it's really gross. Like it's not quite brown, but it's also not quite green. Like it's really like fancy fabric because you can see there's shine to it, but it's such an unfortunate color that you can tell that the costume designer clearly made that choice for her. And then in contrast, you see Ozzy, and he's kind of dressed to emphasize, again, his wealth with this overly patterned vest and the very clean looking black. So I don't know, just very clear color associations that just make him look so skeevy.
Yeah.
Every time he walks out on the screen, I'm just like, ugh, he needs to go away. But yes. And then... let's see. Oh, so this is later on, and I wanted to show a little contrast again between Demelza and Caroline. And then I didn't talk too much about him, but this is the little character, the poet, who basically falls in love with Demelza.
He's so
and
cute.
Writes her poetry and all this stuff.
Oh
He's a very charming and really good-looking actor. Oh. But... the main focus here I wanted to look at again was not just the color. You see the kind of pale pink, but you can see also the fabric is like this looks a lot more homespun, and this looks a lot more upper class, like at least some kind of satin maybe or a damask silk or something for Caroline. And then even just the openness, like she's got the fichu, that kind of little scarf that she tucks into her bust to kind of keep it conservative, even though it's see-through. And then Demelza clearly just is kind of a little bit more wild, and like not just her hair is down, but also she doesn't have the fichu fully covering it. And then also just the way that her dress has like the small pattern, it kind of made me think a little bit like Little House on the Prairie almost, which again, it kind of speaks very much to her very earthy character. I think this is the last one. So I didn't go too long, I guess. But the last character I wanted to focus on was a character named Thali Tregarrels.
Oh,
which is such a weird name, right? But he's played by Sam Gilder, and basically the costume designer talked about his character being the pirate.
He looks like a pirate.
Yeah. So he dressed him as a pirate. He kind of comes on a boat from the sea, I think early on either in this season or the end of the previous season. But his quote from the costume designer was, "He's the pirate, sleeping, eating, and breathing in this costume." So again, this idea of like he literally has the one outfit, that's all he ever wears. You can see how much there's even like sea gunk on his headpiece, or like his, I don't know, is this a do-rag?
Little
like
scarf, little hat.
Yeah, exactly. So again, just kind of showing like where he's come from, that he is kind of a naval seaman. There's a lot of this kind of green color to it, as opposed to just like brown dirt. Which, if you are like a costume crafter, all of those little details are so important.
Yes.
To tell you the story of where this costume has been. Like, something that gets dragged through dirt in like a forest is going to stain very different colors than something that's been like rolling around in the grass versus something that's been like covered in sea salt.
Yeah.
So like clearly I just love that that they've really taken the care to distress this properly, and it tells you so much about where he's been.
It totally does.
And then just having little like accessory elements. It looks like this is like a little spyglass. And then he's got his like swashbuckling belt. Mm-hmm. So clearly the pirate, this is him actually digging the grave at the very end because Aunt Agatha dies. So he's about to dig her grave. But And that was the end of the episode. So
Yay!
I didn't really tell you anything about what happened in the episode. So hopefully if you haven't seen this, or if you're about to reach this episode, it didn't spoil anything for you. There's definitely a lot of little secrets and eggs that I think the series hides in there. But if you can make it to season 3, this is a good episode.
Well, and if you're stalled out and you're like, should I keep watching? Now you see these costumes and you say, yes, I should keep watching.
Yes, exactly. Get to this point.
Yeah. Great job.
So, yes. Thanks. I know it always feels like it's going to go so much longer, but this was actually nice quick.
It was a breeze.
I guess with TV, it's faster.
Yeah. Yeah, that was what I found with both of my things that I'm covering is that it's faster. And I actually want to go into my trash and recover one picture I deleted that I regret deleting. Where is it?
Do it. I think I did that last time.
Here it is. Found it.
Also, I'm very excited about this. I love the Outlander costumes.
Outlander's so good.
Beautiful.
Okay. Oh, that's not it. That's the end. All right. So I'm covering today Outlander, and I picked season 1, episode 7, which is called The Wedding. And I picked this episode because it's like one of my favorite episodes. And I think I picked it because it has gorgeous costumes, but not that many costumes. So I can kind of go into depth about them. And I was able to find a lot of like the process behind them. So we can look at some sort of behind the scenes stuff as well.
Fun.
Yeah. Okay. So this is from 2014. It was released. The director is Anna Forrester, who works in TV a lot. She did some Criminal Minds, a lot of Outlanders, and some Jessica Jones. The costumes.
Jessica Jones.
I know. I love Jessica Jones.
Me too.
The costumes for this season are by Terry Dressbach. And she left the show after 4 seasons. So she stuck around for a long time, and she really established like the visual language of the show early on. Some other there were like 3 other designers listed on the show who have, since kind of taken it up. Terry's other work includes a lot of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I was like, hey.
Yes.
Carnival, and a lot of movies in like the late 80s and early 90s.
Oh, I do love Carnival too.
I've never seen it.
I think I watched like 1 episode, but that was about it. Okay. So I didn't get very far.
All right. Well, okay. So let's see. Should I talk about I'll talk about the plot of the show, just like real quick, a rundown. Since I picked a season 1 episode because I was like, it gets really complicated later on and I don't need to get into that. But basically the plot is our protagonist is Claire, and she is a nurse in World War II, and she is on holiday with her husband in Scotland after the war is over, and she accidentally travels through time. She's like in a circle of standing stones. It's like a druid ritual. It's on a holiday, and then she touches the stone, and then suddenly she's gone back in time, and she falls back into 1740s Scotland, where she is basically like chased through the woods by redcoats, and then she gets taken in by some Highlanders who take her in and take care of her and are also very suspicious of her because she's a time traveler. But then she kind of settles in with them. She tries to get back home and it doesn't really work. And then she's being pursued by this one redcoat who like has it out for her. And they decide that the way to keep her safe from this redcoat is to make her an official citizen of Scotland. And the fastest way to do that is for her to get married. So she just so happens to have to marry the hottest one, whose name is Jamie, who conveniently has been in love with her since he met her. It's
how convenient.
Beautiful. So that is where we join our characters in this episode, is that this is their wedding. So she is having a lot of conflicting feelings because she's already married in the 40s, but she doesn't want to get taken by the redcoats and like put in prison or whatever. So she has to marry Jamie. And she's also feeling conflicted because she's also falling for him at the same time, but she's already married. So that's
so many problems to have.
That's where we are. So yeah, I'll go into these Terry Dressbach used to have a blog and a website where she would go really into detail about how she picked everything and her process. She would have behind the scenes photos, and it's been taken down. So,
oh no.
Yeah, I went looking for it because I had read it before and I was like, I'm going to get all the info from there. And then it was gone. So I had to get some information from an interview she did in Variety. And then I was able to kind of recover some of the pictures from her blog on other places. So this episode is sort of like a flashback format where this first picture is Claire in the 40s. So let's start here. And it's sort of, this is her on her wedding day in the 40s. And Frank is her husband in the 40s. And he basically is like, let's get married right now. It's like a spur of the moment thing. Mm-hmm. So the main actress, her name is Katrina Balfe, and her grandma was actually a nurse in World War II, coincidentally. And so this suit is actually based on a photo they found of her grandmother in her wedding suit. So I thought that was really cool.
Wait,
and
like the actual actress?
Yeah, the actress's grandma was a nurse in World War II, just like she's playing in the show.
That's beautiful.
I know, right?
I love that.
Yeah. So it's very 40s, a very simple, streamlined silhouette, kind of utilitarian almost. She has this cute little fedora. And here's a picture of it on a mannequin.
Ooh, so cute.
And it's fun because it's like a dove gray color. And her wedding dress later also ends up being gray. So both of her wedding outfits are gray in her life, which I think is a fun little symmetrical storytelling thing. Mm-hmm. What else? What is I going to say? Okay. So then the episode goes on and we join Jamie and Claire in their, basically it's like a room in a tavern after their wedding. And they're already out of their wedding clothes, sort of just in their underpinnings. Mm-hmm. So it's like a flashback. It's like a bottle episode because they pretty much don't leave that room, except we flash back to the actual wedding and we flash back to the events leading up to the wedding. So let's look at their underwears. Ooh. Ooh, ah. So she spends a lot of the episode in her underwear. And I will say, for our listeners who may not be adults, this episode has a lot of sex in it. Don't worry, I don't have pictures of that.
This show has a lot of...
Yes. Side tangent. I have heard this show referred to as mommy porn, and I get really offended when people say things like that, because the idea that a romance series that appeals to mostly women could be written off as something like that, it makes me so mad. And then B, I think that the sex scenes in this show are really well done. Mm-hmm. I'll just say that. They're not typical of your typical cable, Game of Thrones sort of sex scenes. I think they're really tastefully done. Anyway,
we digress.
That's my rant. So we basically, of course, because it's their wedding night, we basically see every layer of this get stripped off. So she has a petticoat, which I have a picture here, and it has this lovely, it looks corded maybe, the corded bottom. And she had panniers, and I could not find a picture of just the panniers because it's a really brief moment that we see them.
Right.
But those are basically the tiny little cage that goes on each side of your hip to kick the dress out to make it wide. And this is also 1740s, funny enough. We kind of picked the same period.
I know. I was like, oh, this sounds like it's about around the same time in history.
Yeah. And then, of course, she has a corset. And then she has a chemise under it, which is wonderful. God bless a chemise. And let's see. Terry Dressbach said that the embroidered fabric of this corset was actually, she bought it before she was working on the show at an antique stall on Portobello Road in London. And it was just sitting in a box under her desk. And she was like, you know what? I have the perfect fabric for this corset. So I thought that was a fun little story.
I love it.
Oh, and I have a picture of Katrina and her fitting for the corset too. And you can see the chemise. I know, she's skinny. A lot of fans of the books get mad at how skinny she is because in the book she's described as being a little bit curvier of a lady. But I think that she's a good enough actress that we can kind of forgive her for being skinny.
Sometimes that becomes more important when you're filming stuff too. It's if she doesn't have the acting ability, then the size accuracy is not as important.
I would much rather the actor be able to pull off the role than look exactly how they're described in the book, which you can say about Daniel Radcliffe too. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's true.
For Harry Potter. So I love the chemise because you can tell it's like very fine fabric, probably silk. And it looks almost like in certain shots, here's a shot of her just in the chemise. It looks almost like it's bias cut because of the way that it just really flows. I'm not sure though. Don't quote me on that, but it's very pretty.
It is hard to tell. It is really, really gorgeous though. It like clings so well.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to the main event, which is the wedding dress. This is one of my favorite costumes probably of all time ever. Oh.
Ugh, so pretty.
I can't believe this dress. Like, it's so good. The story of how she gets the wedding dress, because it's a very last minute wedding, right? The story is that their friend basically goes to the local brothel and says, like, do you ladies have any dresses laying around that we could borrow or buy from you? And the lady in charge is like, actually, yeah, I have one that was given to us by a lord who bought it for his lady, but then he ran into financial trouble, so he traded it to us for our services.
You know, like you do.
Which I think is delightful. And sure, like, you know, like, yeah.
Why not?
And it just happens to fit her and be perfect. Sure.
Everything lines up real great for her.
So in the interview, Terry said that the wedding is in candlelight. So she really wanted something that would look really good in that lighting circumstance. And that in the period, metallic fabrics had real metal in them. So she wanted to get, and that like they really glow when they're under candlelight. So she went for something, it's like a silver wool, I think.
Oh,
and you can see that it's got
gorgeous.
It's got like a metallic shine. And she needed something that also would look like a wedding dress to a modern audience. Right. Because to a modern audience, white is for your wedding, right? But like that's a very recent development. You know, that's like a 20th century thing that we've decided that you have to wear white. So they picked a color that like says wedding sort of to us, but also could be a period wedding.
Ugh,
so these are some close-up photos from Terry Dressbox blog. What else?
Look at that pleating.
I know, it's cartridge pleated.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, it looks like it.
Of course. I have a picture of the back. I have a picture of the back. Oh
my goodness.
I know.
And that like tiny lacing.
I know. It's got, and the lacing goes through little metal rings that are all hand stitched on. It's lightly boned, you know, because she'll be wearing a corset underneath it too. It's just stunning. Like, she estimated that about 3,000 hours of work went into this one dress.
3,000 hours. I mean, I'm not surprised, but like, for all those people who don't understand what we do and don't understand why they have to pay for that time. Like,
yep.
That's 3,000 hours of my time.
Yep.
That you're not paying for.
Yeah. And this is like a team of people.
Right.
What else do I have? Katrina was not cast until 2 weeks before they started filming, and they built 90% of the show, basically. My gosh. So they had to like jam on her stuff.
I mean, I'm not surprised for film, but that stresses me out so much.
I know.
Just thinking about that, I'm like, you had 2 weeks to figure out this whole thing and like build it and have it fit.
I would hope that it would be like, well, we've started and we're just going to hope that our actress is around this size and we'll kind of take it in if she's smaller. You know,
Right. That sounds so stressful.
Okay, I have more details about the embellishments. So this embroidery is done with real silver metal, like thread, basically.
Wow. Yeah, I can see it.
Embroidered onto net so that it could then be appliqued on so that they could sort of move it around as they wanted. And also so it could be done by multiple people at once so that they could get it done faster.
Right.
And then they painted it to look like it was oxidized too. And then they looked at all sorts of like embellishments and stuff for sort of making the fabric special, basically. But then Terry saw a picture of a 17th century box covered in sheet mica and fell in love with it. So sheet mica looks like this, basically.
Yeah.
It comes in like a big hunk, and then you peel it into little paper thin layers of shiny
They're like little flakes.
rock. Yeah, like flakes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what they did, is that they peeled mica and then they glued it to some fabric and sandwiched it underneath the sheer. So what we're seeing here on this bodice, on this stomacher, there's mica under there. So in the light, this dress like twinkles.
Oh my goodness. My goodness.
I know.
I wish I had the time to do that. Like now I just want to be like, I'm going to quit everything else and just spend 3,000 hours on this beautiful dress. Go outside, find some mica for myself, just insert it into the fabric.
I mean, I know from experience that if I spend a really long time on one thing, I get really tired of looking at it.
That's true.
But I also, looking at a dress like this, like every minute of that had to just be like, I am making the most beautiful thing in the world.
Hopefully they didn't all hate it. Maybe they had to like switch tasks every couple of, hours or whatever.
So. I hope so. So I have a couple just more pictures. Here's the bottom. So it has this sort of like falling leaf motif. Ugh. Absolutely stunning.
I do love that kind of uneven sort of fleck of texture, so that it's not just like all like, it's not all consistent dots all the way up. It's like she clearly made it very gradient.
And it's not like super symmetrical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I'm all about the asymmetry.
Yep, me too. This is the sketch, so that we have that to look at. It's got some swatches there of the fabric and stuff.
Do you know if Terry sketches her own stuff?
I don't. Oh, she signed it to Terry Dressbach, so I assume that this is her.
I love her dress. I love her sketching style.
I know, it's lovely.
So beautiful.
Very nice. And I always wonder if these things are done before or after, because like some people don't do sketches, but I feel like for a dress like this, you probably have to.
Yeah. And with so much detail too, like, builders need to be able to know what it's going to look like. And I feel like for film, you have to be a lot more specific and detailed.
Yeah. I have some pictures of the embroidery in progress too. Here's that. These are from the blog. Up close.
Oh my goodness.
Like a lot of
you
work.
can see the metal.
I know.
It's like thin strips.
I know.
I feel like that's so painful to work with. Like that just makes me feel like I'm in pain.
It did say that, like, I think this bit that almost looks like a chain, it's like a little chain of balls. They said that like the thinner it got, the more likely it was to break. So I think that they had some issues with it sort of breaking, and they probably got poked a lot.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, even trying to get something that small, when you're rubbing up against metal for that long, it's not pleasant.
Ouch. Okay. So that was the wedding dress. I think I've said everything that I needed to say about it, because it's just so I can't. It's gorgeous. So I'm going to finish up a little bit with Jamie. This is his wedding outfit. Very handsome.
Oh, Jamie. So pretty.
So the story of his outfit is that his friends get it from like a widow who it belonged to her husband. So they borrow it from her. Mm-hmm. So this is not his outfit either,
Right.
But it just happens to fit him. I feel like he must be wearing his own kilt, because this is this his same tartan? Let's look. It looks like the same tartan as he always wears.
So.
I don't think he would get married in somebody else's tartan.
Right.
Speaking of, there is sort of like a hot debate about the tartans being used in this show, because some people say that like real Scottish clan tartans from the period were a lot brighter than they are like depicted in this show. Mm. But then some people say that's not true. So it's like nobody quite
contradicting
knows.
Information.
Yeah. And Terry used intentionally a really earthy palette for this show. So like, I think that she intentionally went with not so bright colors, and I think it makes it feel very grounded and very real. Actually, that's why I have this picture. I have this extra picture of Claire and Jamie from another episode that kind of shows the regular, this is Claire's sort of regular get up when she's in the 1700s. So as you can see, very earthy, lots of browns and greens. And Terry actually caught a lot of flack about her work for this show, which makes me very mad, because her work is beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's just simply because there's a book series. So people who were fans of the book came at her about changing things that were described explicitly in the book.
Got it.
Yeah, and then people also came at her about not being specifically period accurate. So she was kind of getting it from all sides of people who were just like, why did you make this choice?
Right.
But it seems to me like her choices are all really thought out and like carefully considered. And if she deviated from the book, it was always for a specific reason. And her husband is actually the creator of the show. So like they would come up with those decisions together. Right. I just feel a little bit bad for her that like she spent a lot of her Outlander career defending her choices when it's so beautiful that she shouldn't have to do that.
Yeah. Well, and this goes kind of back to that episode we talked about with Bridgerton. It's like that show wasn't meant to be period. So like, you know, if you're going to recreate this show, why not let it do what it needs to do and like allow the creative minds to do what they do best? You know, like you're still looking at a really beautiful final product, and to keep arguing about how faithful you are to the book, like there's a reason it becomes a film and it's not a book anymore. You know, like let the book be what it needs to be, and then honor the movie for what it needs to be. Like I don't know. I guess I'm also one of those people that like love seeing the book and like translate it into a movie, but anything that's happening in your head when you're reading a story is always going to be different than what you're seeing in a movie. Like it's just, it can never meet everyone's expectations of the figment of imagination that they've come up with in terms of the characters. So
exactly.
I agree with you. I don't think that's fair to put that on the costume designer. Like she's clearly made creative choices. Like that's what we do as creators. Sorry.
Yep. And it's not like she went, ha ha ha, I'm going to stick it to the book fans by changing this. Like,
exactly.
A book is a book and a movie is a movie. And you have to accept that they're different forms of art, you know, and a TV show is even different than that. And like, if you want the exact book, then you just need to read the book and imagine it in your brain, and then it will always be perfect, you know?
Right, exactly. I mean, that's such a huge expectation, too. Like any show that gets turned from a book, like, yes, of course, readers want to see the books made into films, but it is going to change because you've created, again, those images and characters in your head. There's no way a show can meet every single person's expectation of what that is.
Completely. Somebody's always going to be disappointed. So like, don't take it out on the costume designer. Right. And I know a lot of this because I followed her on Twitter, like while the show was airing. It was like every week when there's a new episode, she was like, I made this decision because this, and I wanted to be like, Terry, like, just don't respond to them.
For it. Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah. I do remember hearing a lot of drama around that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's our thoughts on that. Here's the back of Jamie's costume. I love the kilts in this show. Before watching this show, I had never really seen like a real kilt, where it's like it gets laid out on the floor and you lay down on it and wrap it around yourself. That real freaking kilt. So I think I think that they're beautifully done. And then on the left here, you see his uncle Dougal. And I have another picture of him right here. And so he's, classic. He's like the clan. He's the war chief, I think. He's not the leader of the clan Fraser, but he's like his brother is. So he's like the war chief, I think is what the term that they use.
I think you're right.
And then he's like a very stern man and also kind of weird.
Mm-hmm. Definitely weird.
And then I just have one picture of Jamie in a flashback when they're getting ready for the wedding. And this is kind of like his more worn in everyday vest. You know, he's been riding a horse for several days, I assume. It's been a while since I saw the episodes leading up to this, but that's usually what he's up to. Riding a horse somewhere. And then lastly, I just want to talk about this ring. I really like it. In the show, so this is a thing that's different from the books. In the show, he takes the key to his family home, Lallybroch, and he has the blacksmith make it into the wedding ring for Claire. So it's like super personal and special to him because Lallybroch is like, it's where he always dreamed of taking his wife, and it's where he grew up, and it's his favorite place in the world. So, and then he like lies to her in this episode. He doesn't tell her that that's where it came from until later in the series, which is like, oh, he's like embarrassed that he's already so in love with her, which is adorable.
Aw, Jamie.
So I know. Jamie, like, I need to lower my standards because right now my standards are Jamie or nothing.
It's easy to do that though. He lays everything down on the line.
He's perfect.
It actually, I will say one thing that frustrates me with this show is I feel like he does everything for Claire and she just whines a good chunk of the time.
Yeah.
Like not every time, but there's a lot of times where I just feel like she's so frustratingly like unable to do things for herself, and like he always has to come in and swoop in.
She has a lot of things happen to her.
Yeah.
Like spoiler alert, she almost gets burned at the stake for being a witch. Like she gets kidnapped like several times. Right. In the book, she fights off a wolf with her bare hands. Like crazy stuff happens to Claire.
I don't understand. She's just like, she attracts trouble, but then can't seem to get out of it. And I always feel like it's very, I wouldn't call her like not powerful, because there's definitely moments where I think she stands up for herself. But like, I just feel like there's more empowerment that her character could have had. And I feel like I don't see all of that.
Yeah, later on in the series, when she makes the decision to stay in the 1700s with Jamie, and she basically becomes a healer and a surgeon in the 1700s, yes. I think that's when she develops a lot more agency and kind of becomes, her storyline is no longer about like, do I want to go back? Or how can I get back to the 40s? It's about like, how can I improve the lives of the people in the 1740s, in the 1750s or whatever? Like, and how can I advance their medicine and help them? So I like that. I stopped reading the books because they got way too long. Like the later books,
I thought about reading them, and then I was like, this is a lot of time commitment.
The first one, excellent. Yeah. The second one, pretty good. After that, not into it. But I love the show still. Yeah. I'll keep watching the show.
Great.
Anyway, so in the book, the ring is not this. Right. But I like this better than what's described in the book, which is just sort of like a Celtic design. And I think is a lot more interesting. Yeah. And I think it's really special and sweet.
I like that it's so simple too. Like it doesn't need to be something huge and fancy, but it has a lot more meaning than something that's just, he bought this giant rock for you.
Right. And it really contrasts because for the rest of her life, basically, she wears Jamie's wedding ring on her left hand, I think, and then, or her right hand, whichever one they do in the Scotland at the time. And then her wedding ring from Frank on her other hand, which is just a simple gold band, and it's really shiny. So I really like the contrast of sort of like the old oxidized silver next to the shiny gold of like representing her two different lives. Yeah. I think that's cool. Yeah. So that's it. I think that's all I have to say.
No, that's great. We made perfect time on that one.
Yay! That was a fun one.
That was good. And we got through all of the, the important costumes and still were able to talk about the characters really well. So
yeah.
Great job, Sarah.
Go us. 10 points to us.
10 points
I'm so sweaty.
I know.
I need to open the window for the next episode. I'm sweating.
I might need to stop and grab a little bit of food because I haven't had dinner yet, but
that's fine. We can do that. Okay. Well, let's sign off this one first.
Sounds good. Well, thanks so much for joining us for the costume plot. We had a lot of fun covering these TV shows, and hopefully you enjoyed covering them with us. And maybe if you haven't seen the show, this will get you to start watching these shows because they're really some great costumes and some great story plots in these.
Absolutely. Outlander's on Netflix now, so get into it.
And Poldark is on Amazon Prime. So
nice.
If you do have Amazon Prime, it's all free.
Awesome. So thanks so much for listening.
See you on the next one.
See you then. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Costume Plot. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Costume Plot. If you have a question, comment, or movie suggestion, you can email us at thecostumplot@gmail.com.
Our theme music is by Jesse Tim, and our artwork is by Jojo Siu. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to your podcasts.